do a little countdown.
Okay.
And then Jamar, you can start it off.
Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Wilmington Public Library. We have some very distinctive guests with us today. We have Dr. Imani Perry, who is an interdisciplinary scholar on race, African-American studies. She's a professor at Princeton University. I'm particularly fond of Dr. Perry because I think that her canonization of Lorraine Hansberry, I think is tantamount to what Alice Walker did with Zora Neale Hurston. So I just applaud her for that. That is monumental and groundbreaking. So I'm just delighted and honored to have her here. And my esteemed colleague, Dr. Nicole Cook, will be moderating the conversation today. Dr. Cook is the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. She's a trailblazer in the industry. She has done great work in helping the industry become more equitable, become more inclusive. So Dr. Cook, thank you for your work. Dr. Perry, thank you for your work. So at this time, I will turn over the conversation to Dr. Cook.
All right, good evening, and thanks so much to Jamar and the wonderful staff at the library for this kind invitation, and really just this opportunity to have a chat with Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry, I am a fan, so this is, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about two of your books, Breathe, a letter to my sons, and also, as Jamar mentioned, your wonderful work on Lorraine Hansberry.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start out with Breathe, and Breathe is broken into 3 sections entitled Fear, Fly, and Fortune. So I wanted to know if you could talk to us a little bit about your thoughts and what was behind this naming convention.
Yeah, so thank you so much. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you. So the 3 sections are really, for me, were a way of putting the book in conversation with previous works. So first, Richard Wright's Native Son, which has the sections Fear, Flight, and Fate. Mm-hmm. And then Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me has the same 3 sections. And I wanted to play on those concepts because from the perspective of a mother of Black sons mm-hmm. who face, a very particular form of racism and racial violence, I wanted to be in conversation, but also be very honest about what it meant to be for this conversation happen from the perspective of a mother, right? Mm-hmm. So that for me, the fear is there, but the fly is about, as opposed to being about fugitivity, was about wanting them to fly, mm-hmm. wanting them to soar. Yes. And I thought about that moment in Richard Wright's Native Son, where he and his friends are looking up at airplanes in the sky and talking about they don't let us do that, right? And then I was also mm-hmm. thinking about in that moment, my kids are from Tuskegee families on both sides.
Okay.
And so we have the flight legacy, and sort of think about how you navigate the certainty of racism as well as aspiration, right? And then fortune, what I wanted to do, as opposed to, fate, which is always uncertain and which is often tragic. I wanted to tell them to think about, well, what is it that we do have? Mm. And the fortune is our tradition. Mm. It is our resilience. It is our way of withstanding, of soaring, despite of community, of having love. And so it was so the structure was inherited in some ways, but I also wanted to introduce another conversation, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And, when you were talking about fortune and what is our legacy and our culture, and it reminds me of one of the passages where I think you were in a cab
Yeah.
And you were talking about really just the value and the beauty and the meaning of our names and how we
Yes.
should always hold on to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's really the naming is, we've had all these conversations, and that's like, in previous texts about names too, right? Like, so, when Malcolm decides he wants to give up his slave name, and when we talk about, when Baldwin was another info, obviously because there's an engagement with Baldwin because of the letter to his nephew, but he bears the name of the stepfather, right, with whom he had a very difficult relationship. And there's an older brother who was his father's biological, and he has this whole interesting conversation with his, with his older brother who suffered so much more. And so to think about, like, our names come from, they often honor the past, but it's often a very, like, complicated past, right? So my eldest son is named Freeman for an ancestor who freed himself, from slavery, right? I mean, and that is, but he was enslaved, right? That's part of our story. So anyway, yeah, so.
No, absolutely. No, I really appreciated that, especially, as scholars who deal with race and racism and equity, diversity, inclusion,
Yes.
and just even something so simple as, our children are people who have particular names that are considered family names, or but by others they're considered too ethnic.
Right.
And we have to tell them, when you're applying for a job, maybe you go by your middle name, or maybe you use initials. And so, it's the push and pull of it, something we're so proud of, that adds to, the difficulties we often experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, Breathe is, I really thought it was a love letter to your sons, woven through stories. And so another story that particularly struck me, and it was interesting that you've already mentioned this idea of fear, was a house alarm kept going off. And the police were called, and you called your son on a phone and said, go in your room and lock the door and don't come out, because in the event that the police came into your home, you wanted your child to be safe in his own home. And so, we all know about the talk, that we all have as Black children. And it was just really striking because we always think about this talk when we leave the house. We don't think about it in our house.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about that, this idea of being a mother to Black sons at this moment in time.
Yeah.
And then after, I was wondering if you could also talk about, I know you don't have daughters, but just you are a Black woman.
Yes.
But what that, and previously a Black girl, and what that means in today's society. And I'm thinking about Ma'Khia Bryant, that was killed in Columbus, Ohio. I'm thinking about Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and just so many more, and what that means.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this moment, it was terrifying, but it also, when I was like, these police might come into my house and see my beautiful, tall, dreadlocked child and assume he's a predator, assume that he was the person. And so, right. So the immediate thought I had is I have to keep him safe. He has to keep his door locked. But it's not as though I wasn't fearful too, it for myself. Right. And I think that's the thing, this, and these dimensions of, like, fear and violence are so complicated because, they hit different portions of our communities in different ways, right? So police violence more likely to be experienced by Black boys and young men, but not exclusively, obviously. And so, and we have to, but there are other forms of violence, that Black girls and women experience more likely: sexual violence, domestic violence, right? And those situations are still related to law enforcement in the sense that we are vulnerable. Like, I mean, in many ways, right? So this is not, it turned out to be a deer, right? That kept bashing into the door. We didn't know at the time. But there are moments when home is not safe and we're afraid to reach out because the police don't protect, and they might make the situation worse. I mean, it's sort of like layers of vulnerability that we experience in a community which is often very under-resourced, where it's hard to get appropriate interventions and care. And so I think that's part of the love letter dimension. And part of what I wanted to communicate to my children also was, a recognition of their vulnerability, a recognition of my own vulnerability, right? And our collective vulnerability, and that we have to develop some ethics and care and love in the midst of it, right? One of the things, my mother used to make me do when we would travel everywhere we went. And I thought she was doing something. She was like, I was trying not to spend money, but we would get on public transportation everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought this was like, there's a lesson, but there was, because, everywhere we went, I felt as though I learned to be deeply comfortable and in the presence of our people. And that was an important lesson, especially as I went to these like institutions outside of our community for education.
Yes.
And I feel like was a part of the lesson too, like how, the problem of policing is part of a large network of issues that we that we suffer from. And I wanted to communicate that. And
Yeah, absolutely. Now I have another question that's actually related to ethics. It's not squarely related to your book, but
okay.
I wanted to, because I follow you on Twitter, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, many years ago. And it was recently discovered that the remains of some of the children that were killed in that incident were being kept at University of Penn in the museum, and then later transferred to Princeton University, and they were being used in anthropological teaching. And the family had no idea, right? So when you're talking about this lack of really humanity and lack of ethics as it pertains to Black communities of color, and just being viewed as subjects, and wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I will say initially, my thoughts will probably still be jumbled. I am furious and devastated.
Yeah.
Still. So early in the term, I was teaching a class and we were talking about the Agassi photos that are possessed by Harvard University of people, enslaved people on the plantation in South Carolina. And how the family sued, the descendants have sued the university to get possession of them, and they lost, right? And so Harvard, and that enraged me.
Yes.
Right. And I remember being a student there, and the depth of discomfort, so there were conversations about it, but like, what is this place? That's 1850, right? These kids who were killed by the police in Philadelphia were my age peers.
Right.
It's 1985.
Yeah.
You can feel the impact still of the MOVE bombing.
Right.
Several weeks ago, I was with Mike Africa Jr. and my sons participating in a music video shoot. And, I thought about, what flashed for me is the first public speech I gave that was at a political demonstration was in support of Mumia. It was in Connecticut. I was 21 years old. And all the moments being with my dad and Pam Africa and all these moments, and that, not being really close, but seeing that as part of my community of solidarity over the course of my life. And then feeling a great deal of shame about belonging to an institution that would layer on top of this grotesque violence just the ultimate disregard for the remains, for the suffering of the family, for the children. I just, and there are people who respond like, well, that's what forensic anthropologists do. well, if that's what they do, then that's still unethical and shameful. But
Absolutely.
also, people knew who these remains belonged to, and they did not tell the family. And so I tell my older son about this, and he was literally speechless.
Mm.
He is a child from Philadelphia. Like, the proximity is one thing, which, we all feel, and we have to be careful about, right? Because we can't colonize other people's stuff. Like, it's not me, it's not my,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But for me, I'm like, y'all, the way that I immediately felt, you would treat me the same way.
Of course. Yes. Yeah.
So what do I look like as a representative of this institution at this point?
It's a different type of solidarity.
Right.
Yeah.
And so so obviously, I believe, and there's lots of people and lots of my students and colleagues who are insisting that there be some repair, but there's a bigger ethical question, and I'm trying, and I think eventually I will write about it. But what does it mean to produce? We have a history of evil ways of producing knowledge, but
Mm-hmm.
we also there's a present, and hear from students who are like, I was in that class, I didn't. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, to be made complicit.
Right. Yeah.
So I know it's not a real answer, but I just
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely an answer. Yeah, I've seen so many reactions that are really the same, I think, because we feel that connection culturally, even if we're not from the geographic area.
Yeah, right.
And it's just because of what you said. It's like, that we would be treated the same.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that brings me to my next question. We're going back to the book.
Okay.
There are a couple of sections where you talk explicitly about whiteness.
Yeah.
And how you're teaching and talking to your sons about whiteness. And there was one line, you said, this line may get me in trouble. And as an academic, that made me chuckle. Yeah.
It did.
So I wanted you to talk about, even when we know as academics and just in our daily lives, when we raise issues that other people find uncomfortable or distasteful because of their own, guilt and anger and whatnot. Why is it important to talk about whiteness? Why is it important to take that risk?
So this is right. So I said I teach my kids not to love white people as white people, right? Because and we all know this, but it's always worth repeating, right? From birth, we are inundated with the image of white people as superior at every single turn. Black parents have to be very deliberate to keep their children from being brainwashed by the ideology of white supremacy. It is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's everywhere. And so and it's not just, and people think, oh, this is just a matter of teaching your children pride. No, you have to undo the logic that white people are superior. That's more than, so yes, I'm teaching my children to love Blackness, but it is also important that they don't love the system that diminishes them.
Yes.
And to me, what is the point of all of our all of our training, all of our research, if we can't tell that simple truth? Mm-hmm. There's all kind of truths that we are discouraged from telling all the time. And I do feel like, and some of them just strategically, you don't say everything, right? But there's some things that you just have to say. Like, you can't, that to me, it goes back to ethics. Like, would I be a decent person if I didn't point this detail out, right? And that is different. White people who are individuals is a very different matter than the category of white people. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's also telling that that really bothers people, because for me, it makes me feel, oh, you want me to think that you're superior. I don't. We don't, right? Like, I'm not going to do that. If you require that for me to be in community with you, that's on you. That's not on me.
Right. Yeah. And it's, it's just thinking, what you said, it's, when we're having these conversations, if white people would realize that it's about the group and not themselves individually,
Right.
we could get further in these conversations.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
And when they don't, I'm like, okay, hit dogs holler. Something is going on
Okay.
here.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure. For sure. So the last question I want to ask you about Breathe before we
Right.
move into Lorraine, it might actually be a transition question.
Okay.
So you always have music in your writing, and it's very a substantive theme, and you weave your narrative around different artists and different songs and things of that nature. So I wanted to ask you if you would talk a little bit about why music is so important in
Yeah.
your narratives.
Yeah. So I mean, I love music. I write I either write about music, or music becomes a vehicle through which I can think. I mean, I think, part of it is there I think there are lots of beautiful artistic traditions all over the world, all kinds of people. But I think there's really nothing like the Black American musical tradition. I mean, I just think it's the apex of musical artistry. It is a core of who I think we are. And so I guess that's like why it's the art that, I always have this, and this is, I've been saying this since I was to myself, since I was like a late teen, like we can do all sorts of things, but we can't forget the things that we are really, really good at. Right.
Yes.
And that's a part.
Yeah.
So part of that is is holding on to that. And I also had this moment actually at the Mississippi Festival of the Book years ago, which is like, so they have all the Mississippi writers, and I'm originally from Alabama, so I'm a little bit huffy, right? Because they say, Mississippi loves its writers the way Alabama loves its football players, which is kind of true, right? And so I'm like huffy, and they have Margaret Walker up there, and I'm like, she's from Birmingham, like she's not really from Mississippi, but whatever. So so I'm having this whole fussing in my head. But I also started thinking about, we have all these musicians as writers and mothers, right? Like, so, Stevie Wonder's mother was a writer. The Clark sisters' mother was a writer. There's all these Black women from Alabama who were music writers. And so so that's like part of more explicitly part of how I identify myself as a writer. So all of that. And yeah, and I'm not a musician. I'm glad one of my children is, but it feels like if I could do anything else, that would be what I'd want to do. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So let's get into looking for Lorraine, the radiant and radical life of Lorraine Hansberry.
Yes.
Such a fantastic work. And, a lot of people only know Lorraine from Raised in the Sun, whether you read it in school or you read it, in a different occasion. But I was really taken by your subtitle where you say that she is radiant and radical, right? Yeah. Maybe two words that we don't necessarily always put together.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that word choice and introduce us to Lorraine as more than the author of Raised in the Sun?
Yes, sure. So Lorraine was extraordinary. And I started the book thinking, everybody was like, always like, okay, she only lived to 34 years old. What might have happened? And then I get in the archive and I'm like, this is like 100 years worth of living she did in 34 years.
Okay.
I mean, she lived, she had so, she's born to a kind of bourgeois Black family on the south side of Chicago in 1930. And she immediately, really at a young age, is identifying with the working class kids in her neighborhood. And she says that she loves them because they would fight back, right? Like they were not always trying to do the respectable kind of fighting. Like they'd be like, I heard you was talking about me. Like, what's up? Like, and she loved that, which, and so she goes through school and she kind of develops this deep intellectualism, curiosity, but is not a particularly great student, which I also loved, because so often, you know, we have these brilliant young people who are not recognized for their brilliance because they're not great students. And then she decides to live this kind of expansive life. She sort of rejects the expectations of a middle class, you know, debutante, and, you know, goes to New York, hangs out in the village, cuts off her hair, is trying to like be an artist and intellectual. She is an activist long before Raisin in the Sun.
Okay.
She's
Yes.
being mentored by W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson in writing, and she goes to an international peace conference in Uruguay and then has her passport taken because it's, you know, affiliated with the Communist Party. I mean, so politically, she is aligned with the far left, and she aligns with people a generation older than her. So she becomes this bridge. And then towards the end of her life, she's working with the students in Mississippi and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right.
So she has this like generational bridge. And she's a voracious reader, and she writes all the time. And so she did all this So here I am looking at her archive, and I'm like, there's a lot of work of hers that nobody has seen.
Okay.
And there's also this interior life that people hadn't seen. Lorraine identified as a lesbian. She was very close to James Baldwin, very close to Nina Simone. That's a part of her that was not apparent.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, how do I tell a story, even though people haven't seen all this, that is true to her and true to what was important for her to preserve, and help us read A Raisin in the Sun, but also the two other plays that she finished before death in a way that is richer and fuller and more, you know. And so it was an absolute delight. And I will say, I really appreciated Jamar's introduction, because in some ways I do, like, I was trying to do what Alice Walker did. And there's another biography of Hansberry that's out that I hope people get, called Radical Vision, by Soyika Colbert. That just came out. And I'm like, okay, so and Valerie Boyd did this incredible book on Zora Neale Hurston. So it's also like this sense of a team of Black women writers.
Love it.
Who've been trying to bring her, and that has been such a healing experience for me as an academic.
Okay.
Because we've been able to be in community, and then Tracy Strain's documentary, and we talk to each other and we share materials. And Margaret Wilkerson, who was literally pulling boxes of Hansberry's writing out of the basement of her house, who's been working on her for 30 years, that we have all been very deliberate about affirming each other. And so it's sort of like Lorraine, I think, like Zora, like pulls people who are passionate about her together in ways that like cut against so much of the negative culture of both the academic world and the writing world.
Because that's what I was going to ask you. I was like, that seems so rare for academics to be.
It's so rare.
But such community, yeah.
But I do think working on somebody who reminds you like what it's for.
Right. Yeah, it's very different. Yeah, yeah.
This is for our freedom. This is for our liberation. This is for like, you know, this is not for like our little, you know, petty things that we worry about in the 21st century. Yeah.
Well, you answered one question, and I'll just tell you that I was going to ask you about the archives, you know, as a librarian.
Yes.
And an archives geek. And, you know, myself really trying to get into this writing of our stories. So mine would be about writing of our library history and our, you know, the wonderful activists that came. You know, I'm in a position named for Augusta Baker, who was this legendary Black librarian at New York Public, you know, that was in that activist scene and knew, you know, she was James Baldwin's children's librarian. She was also Audre Lorde's librarian, and Audre Lorde credited Augusta Baker with teaching her how to read. And so, you know, being just immersed in it. And so I'm really, you know, loving this discussion about, you know, how you were like pouring through her archives and trying to figure out, you know, how to tell her story, because you tell such a beautiful story and just, you know, this intimate portrait of her, and really, you know, letting us get to know her in different ways.
Thank you so much. I'll just, you know, so similarly, just, I won't get off too much off topic, but I'm working on this project now that is called the Black Teacher Archive, where we are
Yeah.
trying to digitize all of the state-based Black Teacher Association journals over the 20th
Okay.
century.
Yeah.
And it's the same idea, because wouldn't it be, it's just sort of like, wouldn't it be wonderful to know all of these thinkers who what did their teachers have them read, right? Like what
Right.
did, right?
Right.
What did they, what were common texts? How did they talk about the challenges of teaching Black children? Like all of these sorts of things. And I do think that work, all of, librarians, teachers, athletic directors, principals, people, civic organizational leaders, like that's the thing, that is the part of the history that we really have not centered nearly enough to understand.
And they're shaping these people, right? And such a
Profoundly.
great influence, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure,
Yeah.
for sure. So speaking of James Baldwin, or Jimmy as he's known,
Yes.
You see a lot of memes about James Baldwin, and there's kind of like this renaissance of his work. And, you were talking about Du Bois and Robeson and these wonderful activists and thinkers that Lorraine studied with and communed with. So, when you see all of this history, being on social media and younger generations talking about them, they don't talk about Lorraine.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, I think I know the answer, but I want to hear your thoughts about why she's not included. And if you think that she may have been more radical than them.
She certainly was more radical than Baldwin. And she did a lot of political education of Baldwin. I mean, so he gets in his later years closer to where she was.
Okay.
And so there's, and even around questions around sexuality, Baldwin really didn't like to be, I mean, he is identified as someone who was gay. That was not his identity. He was sort of more like, fall in love with boys, fall in love with girls. Like that's how he would say it. And she was like, for her, lesbian was a political identity too. Like she was connected it to her being a feminist and trying to build one's own life outside of the strictures of patriarchy. So even that, she was sort of, I think, ahead of him on, right? Like not averse to. So part of it is sexism, right? I mean, it's a big part. Part of it is the way. Part of it is that she did die young.
Yes. Yeah.
But the sexism part is a bit like, I'm even thinking about, even with the civil rights movement, we're still like, it's rare to hear about Ella Baker or Diane Nash.
Yes.
Or even with all this, two new books on Rosa Parks, but she's not memed, right?
Oh, no.
Right. And so that's a big piece of it. And I struggled with that. Like I started the book thinking like, I'm going to put her in her rightful place. But then I was like, we don't need icons. We need people to help us think about how to be in the world.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't want to write this book in a way that now everybody has a Lorraine Hansberry sticker. I want to write it in a way that they think, okay, yeah, she was vulnerable and fallible and dealt with depression and fear and anxiety and figured out how to do something beautiful and meaningful regardless. And that, because I feel like that's what we're all trying to, figure out. And that's so she made me kinder to myself. And that's what I wanted her story to do for lots of people, right? Like she had all these moments of doubt and insecurity, and like, she would freak out over airplanes. And I'm like, I freak out over so much stuff. Right? Like, so I'm like, that's helpful,
Yes, no, it really is. And that it's just perfect segue. She wrote a letter to Nina Simone, and that was also fascinating to me that she had this relationship with Nina Simone. And there was one letter where she was very, very frank about her loneliness.
Yes.
And, that kind of got me in the gut, because we all deal with that, and the difference between being lonely or having loneliness and, working through that and figuring that
Yeah.
out. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think
Right,
that's
yes.
definitely one of those lessons you just referenced.
It's so much, especially now, because this past
Right.
year and a half, whew, I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
it's just devastating in so many
Yes.
different ways.
Yes.
Um, and I thought, for me, as I read, I was like, okay, she has all these friends, these people who love her. She's profoundly lonely.
Mm.
Nina was profoundly lonely. Jimmy was profoundly lonely. And it hurts your heart and you don't want it to
Yes.
be so, but it's a thread of connection.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, I know what that feels like a
Mhm.
lot.
Mhm.
Right. And that's also important and kind of the human thread, the way that, she and I will say this. So there were things that I decided not to put in the book because it was very clear to me these were not communications that she would want to be public.
Okay. Yes.
Right. And so it's interesting to see how her letters and papers are sorted. I do think that it's very clear because there are people, that it's very clear that there are some things that were private then, but she preserved them for a reason, right? Like
Right.
she's
Right.
saving this for
Yeah.
us. And there are other things that especially if they're like communications from other people, like communications that Robert Nemiroff, her husband, got after
Okay.
her death, that I was like, I don't know, like she may have thought this would never come back to her, right?
Right.
Like, and so,
Right.
but the loneliness, because it's in her date books, it's
Mm.
in her, letters with other famous people, it's in her, so it's in her poems, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it's a theme of her life, and it's a theme of many lives, and it's a theme that is particularly true of many intellectuals and artists' lives. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, it's like this is good for people to know and feel and
Yeah, I
resonate
mean,
with.
it
Yeah.
really just speaks more and more to her humanity,
Yes.
and that she was a real person.
A very real. Yes.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
perfect. So before we get into some questions from our audience,
Okay.
I wanted to just simply ask you, what's next for you? I know you mentioned that you have
Yes.
a new book coming out. Love to hear
Yes.
about that.
So my next book is called South to America, deliberately, and it is so the basic premise of the book is I'm trying to argue that the South is the heart of the nation, for better and worse.
Mhm.
And not just in terms of the nation begins there, right? So you could say 1619 is a year before, Plymouth, 1620, but also earlier, right? So really talking about the 1500s, right?
Right.
You have with Havana
Mm.
literally in 1520 and the Florida coast. So if we're talking about the history of European empires trying to establish settler colonial states in this country, that's the Southern, and the ways that they adopted of this passion for the land and its abundance,
Mhm.
innovation with it, but also killing, genocide, exploiting people to
Mhm.
work the land, working the
Mhm.
land to death until it couldn't
Mm.
cough up any more reasons. That starts there
Yeah.
and spreads to the rest of the country and shapes how the United States interacts with the rest of the world, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And so that story for me is, and so many things that we think so whether it's supermarkets, soft drinks, candy, like all these things that are the norms of our country, oil, which we live by, the whether you're talking about gushers in Texas or mountain,
Right.
uh, all of these kind of ways of doing and being that in addition to building the wealth of the nation with cotton, right? So and also the way we destroy lives for what our vices, like I talk a lot about tobacco and
Mm.
sugar,
Yes.
right? And the
Yeah.
desire, these pleasures that actually have Black people's blood in them, right? And historically, and so
Mhm.
and indigenous folks too, of course. And so so it's a contemporary story, but it's a contemporary story about the foundation of the nation
Mm.
And it does have some, 2 chapters take place in the Caribbean, actually.
Mhm.
And so the idea, so I traveled for several years, and the idea is to tell this story, but also to look for the glimpses of hope in the region about how we can do things differently, how we can
Mhm.
imagine differently, how we can have a different relationship to land, how we can have a different relationship to humanity. So that's the idea. And it's also like, for me, it's like, people think of the South as backwards, but actually the South has led the way in every single thing
Yeah.
that has happened in this country. And I don't mean that as necessarily a praiseworthy thing, but it
Well,
is
no,
what it
right,
right.
right. Well, yeah, and I mean, I when we were speaking before the session started, I told you that I'm from New Jersey. So when I moved to South Carolina for my
Yeah.
current position, I'm learning all of that. And
Right,
it's and
amazing, right? And
it's not,
Charleston, whoo, yeah.
yeah, and it's not something you necessarily learn, particularly if you didn't have family or, that you
Mhm.
spent summers with. So, no, I will definitely be looking forward to your next book. And you said
Appreciate it.
January of 2022?
Yes.
Okay, very
Yep.
good. So we'll
Yep,
look
yep,
out
yep.
for that. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank
Yay.
you. So I'm going to turn it over to our friends at the
Okay,
library, and we're going to field some questions from our audience.
great. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Perry and Dr. Cook, for such an amazing conversation. We are going to ask the first question that we have from an offline viewer. How do you balance the movement of embracing diversity with the need for empowerment and education for solely African Americans?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that they're at odds, right? I mean, the reality is that we occupy what is still an incredibly segregated society. And it is segregated because of a resistance. In some ways, you can think about the mainstream civil rights movement as Black people offering a different kind of relationship in the country to race, right? A kind of invitation to actually living out the principles of the Constitution and the Reconstruction Amendments. And there is a decision to refuse that with white flight, with people building segregation academies, with abandonment of inner cities and the like. So in some ways, so I answered that way because the truth is that we overwhelmingly live in Black communities, and we have work to do in those communities every day. And so when we enter into, diverse communities or predominantly white communities, it's not as though that work ends, right? It's like that's a space that has certain things that we need to do there to make sure that they are good and fair and safe spaces for us. And often they're not. And so that's one labor, but it's not as though that allows us to abandon what needs to happen in our communities. My mother talks about this. She's an education scholar. She always talks about this as the difference between advocacy and self-activity. That you never give up self-activity for advocacy, right? So we might be making claims to the larger society. It's important to be inclusive. It's important for this place to be more fair, all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, we have to do things in our communities for our communities, engage in care work, engage in education work, engage in the work of nurturing, of building healthy spaces. It's hard, of course, because of incredible inequality and people being overextended, and how hard it is to both, work and live and take care of one's families, and the like, especially now because people tend not to sort of join organizations the way they used to, or be part of community groups in the way that they used to. But I don't, so to me, the balance is hard. But the answer is, it's sort of like, we don't have any choice. Um, one of the things, I think, even especially as a parent, right? Like, because as parents, we tend to be sort of privatized. Like, we're like, okay, I'm going to take care of my child. I'm going to do this and do that. But the last thing we want is for our children to be alone in being able to navigate the world, right? To not have other Black young people beside them who are also able to navigate the world effectively. We don't want them to be lonely. We don't want them to be isolated. And for me, that's always the reminder, right? It can't just be for your kids. It can't just be for the people in your family. You have to think beyond your immediate concerns. So.
Wow, great answer. And this is sort of like piggybacking off of that last question. Do you think systemic racism will ever end? If so, what would it take? And if not, why?
So I will say this. I stopped believing in utopias a while ago. And what I mean by that is I don't think about ends. I think about doings, right? Like how we live, how we work. I don't know. And I also don't know what that world would be. It wouldn't be the nation as we've ever seen it, right? This would, if we're talking about the country, this as a country, and then globally, it's a whole, I mean, it would have to be a whole other global epic. I found a glimmer of hope that was frankly quite dramatically dashed in the midst of COVID, because I was like, oh, here's this virus that lets us know all these boundaries and borders and stratifications that we create are fictional. This virus can travel across oceans, it can travel across doorways, it can travel. And I thought maybe people will be transformed now because they will see we are in one collective human community. And now we have this copyright stuff where like they're not like there's no commitment on the part of these US corporations to say, yeah, we have to vaccinate the world because they want to hold on to, and it's like, oh, is this okay? So maybe this will be the point where capitalism actually does us in, right? I mean, that this doesn't make, so all of that to say, I'm not optimistic. And I think that racism and capitalism are so tightly intertwined that it's very, when you see things like that, it's very hard because it's about hoarding. It's about who has opportunity, who has wealth, which group is exploited, which group exploits. And obviously there's crossing between groups, but that ultimately is what it boils down to, right? The people who were colonized and enslaved and trying to sustain that relationship or not, that's at the heart of racism. So I'm not optimistic, but what choice do we have but to try and work against it, right? I mean, we don't have a choice. So we do it. We do the work. We do the work of trying to transform. Those of us who are educators, we try to help people see differently, to learn, to believe in ethics, to believe in imagination, not for the sake of like just imagination, like how can I make more money? But how can we live better? How could we create different social structures? So yeah, that's all I got. You know, there's no other choice. We just have to try, you know.
Thank you. And on a different note, Jamar asked, what are your thoughts on Howard University dissolving their classics department?
Well, let me say this. I think it is not the business of anyone who is not at Howard University. That's my first thought. I think that's their business. My personal feeling about classics as a field, I think it is so deeply embedded with white supremacist ideology that I have a deep aversion to it. But it's not my field. I don't know internally what happened at Howard University. I find it disturbing that people on a national stage are getting into the business of an HBCU that ordinarily they don't tend to care about or pay attention to. That bothers me, especially white conservatives. So I wouldn't opine, but I do think this question, I will say this, I do appreciate, this is something I do know about Howard. Howard is one of the places that takes the study of ancient African civilization seriously. So to whatever extent I am critical of classics, I understand that they have a more expansive idea of what counts as classic civilizations than many institutions. So I will grant them that. Other than that, I don't, I'm not in it. My name is Bennett.
Got it. And so what is your solution to the police using lethal force so readily in the African American community?
I mean, I don't know. I don't have a solution. I do think that, okay, this is the baseline. One, I think that we have a problem as a society that thinks the way you resolve social problems is to lock people in cages. Right, that's the first order. And when you start from that premise, right, that you put people in cages, as opposed to thinking about things like employment, decent housing, basic resources, then you build an entire structure on top of it, right? So we have a structure where police are called in for all kinds of things that would have more effective solutions. Also, we have a structure of criminal law that includes many, many things that are classified as crimes that don't have to be, right? So there's all kind of misdemeanors that don't hurt anybody that then demand police intervention, right? So, and I say it this way because if you start by saying, okay, I'm an abolitionist, which I'm not yet at that point, I will say honestly. But if you start that, people say, well, how, a police abolitionist, right? People say, well, what would you do? What do you do if this happens or that happens if you don't have police? And I think that's, for me, that's not the way we think about it. The way we think about it is, how do we imagine structuring things differently where that isn't the only resort, right? And in many instances, not only is that only resort, but police officers, and this is actually a really important point to me because we let a lot of government officials off the hook. Police officers are incentivized to interact with as many people as possible. They interact with Black people and Latinx people because we are the lowest people on the totem pole. If you have an expectation, you have to have this number of arrests a month. Who are you going to go arrest? You're going to arrest the people who are the lowest status people. That's who you're going to harass. And every time a politician says, when they're campaigning, we got to have law and order, we got to be tough on crime. The message immediately, when they get in office, the message is we have to have more arrests, right? And this is formalized, right? These expectations. And then often they get promoted based upon the number of arrests. So a lot of times I feel like these politicians are being really dishonest because they'll say, oh, we need this, we need that. But you are the ones who have told these people to harass us, right? And have rewarded them when they harass us. So yes, police are infiltrated by white supremacy. Yes, there are lots of extremely racist police officers, but the structure is rotten. And so, so my position is that we really do have to do major restructuring, but it's not only of policing, right? It's a lot of institutions.
Wow. And we have one more question, and then I'll yield the floor to Dr. Cook and yourself to close it out.
Okay.
What lasting effects do you think the pandemic will have on our nation? And do you think we'll see some sense of normalcy soon?
So I think that's a great question. I think that the lasting effects of the pandemic are going to be huge. I think we are going to come out of this with a lot of, one, long COVID has led to a lot of disability. There are people who are permanently disabled as a consequence of living with this illness. There's also a lot of long-term mental health consequences. There are people whose entire lives are now in shambles, and I'm talking about both like families that have lost many people. I'm talking about people who have been hungry and out of work for over a year with a very inadequate kind of stimulus response. So we're talking about multiple generational effects. The good news is from what I see from young people, they are amazing because they have been experiencing the effect of COVID. They have been experiencing the effect of seeing a society where we deal with police violence. They have seen the effect of the Trump era, and they are not about to just sort of go along to get along. they're really, really critical, and they are open to lots of different transformations. And so I'm really, really excited about, you know, my kids' friends, my students, these young people who I think are good. So I'll say this, I don't think normal was good. I don't think we're going to go back to normal. My hope is that we go to something better, right? And the something better, as part of the hope, will include, you know, a society where we expect that the government does have some responsibility for its citizens, right? Like you know, there's a lot of kind of, you know, bootstraps, you know, you got to take care of yourself stuff. And we should know now, you know, with you know, that is not sufficient, especially for a wealthy country like this. So, you know, hopefully on the other side, we can get to something better, but we should be prepared, at least for those of us who are like grown, we're going to be living with the effect of COVID for the rest of our lives, without question.
Thank you so much for your insight. And Jamar pointed out that after the Spanish flu epidemic, there was the Harlem Renaissance. So, you know, so hopefully history will repeat itself in that regard.
Yeah.
So now I will yield the floor to Dr. Cook and yourself, Dr. Perry, to close it out for us.
Thanks.
All righty. Thank you so much. This has just been the most wonderful conversation. And I just want to close our session tonight by asking you, what gives you hope?
Oh, what a great question. It's also been really wonderful talking to you. It's just a delight. I've enjoyed you so much. You know, I guess it's this, you know, I don't know, it might sound a little corny, but our people give me hope. I mean, it's like, you know, this is hard, this period of issues is hard, but then you just look at the ancestors and you're like, that's the source of the strength. I mean, they made it possible for us to be here, which is really quite unbelievable. Like, I think generations born and died in bondage had enough faith to believe that freedom was possible. You know, if they could sustain hope, I can figure it out.
Yes.
Right? That's my
it reminds me of that t-shirt, "We are our ancestors' wildest dreams."
Yeah.
And on that wonderful note, thank you so much. And thank you to Jamar and the great staff at Wilmington Public Library for hosting this session and just giving us this opportunity. So it's been wonderful. So thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you all for the wonderful questions. And thanks to Dr. Perry. And with that, I hope everyone has a great evening and rest of the week.
Thanks.